master of disguise? Do you secretly want to be a spy? There's something so fascinating about the world of lies, spies, and deception. Charles Cumming, Charlotte Philby, Khurrum, Rahman, and Holly Watt discuss the art of espionage with Henry Hemming, who is a writer of nonfiction and definitely not a secret agent.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for listening in. My name is Henry Hemming. I'm a historian. I write about spies. I'm the author of the Sunday Times bestseller M, a biography of MI5's Maxwell Knight, and more recently a book called Our Man in New York, which is out next week in paperback. The true story of how MI6 used fake news to help bring America into the Second World War. And I'm joined today for this panel, Lies, Spies, and Deception, by four fantastic novelists who I'll now very briefly introduce before asking them to individually describe their most recent book. So, in no particular order at all, Holly Watt is an award-winning and intrepid journalist. She's worked at the Sunday Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Washington Post. She's reported from all over the world, as far as I can tell. She's even flown on Air Force One. And most importantly, in terms of today, she is the author of the brilliant debut To the Lions, which she won the prestigious Crime Writers Association Ian Fleming Steel Dagger. And most recently, she's written The Deadline, which is fantastic. In fact, all of the books are fantastic. I've really enjoyed going through them. And next up is Khurrum Rahman. By day, Khurrum works in IT for a local authority, but by night, he's the author of three hugely original and acclaimed thrillers centered on the life and times of J. Kassim, lovable rogue, drug dealer, and reluctant MI5 agent. His first book was nominated for the CWA John Creasy debut dagger, and his second book was shortlisted for the Theakston's Old Peculier Crime Novel Prize. And his most recent book is the brilliant Ride or Die, which he'll be talking about very soon. And we're also joined by Charlotte Philby, who, like Holly, also began life as a journalist. She spent 8 years at The Independent and has written for a slew of publications and appeared in all sorts of different media outlets, and has set up her own website, her own podcast. She was shortlisted for the Cudlip Prize at the Press Awards. And most importantly, she's the author of two brilliant books, the thrilling and extremely well-received Part of the Family, and most recently, just a few months ago, it came out, A Double Life, which we'll focus on very soon. And finally, we have Charlie Cumming, who is the revered author of no less than 10 books. Have I got that right? It is 10. Yeah. 10 books, and including The Trinity Six, A Spy by Nature, Typhoon, and most recently, the new and hotly anticipated Box 88, which is coming out in October. Charlie is a best-selling author. He's won numerous awards, and he was once approached by MI6, and we think he turned them down. So let's, should we start with, just to continue the order with which I've done, Holly, would you like to tell us about The Deadline?
Okay, so The Deadline is the second in the series, which started with To the Lions. It's about an investigative journalist called Casey Benedict, and she basically looks into stories that take her all over the world. So The Deadline's partly based looking into an illegal surrogacy ring in Bangladesh, but it also, they go all over the world.
Fantastic. And I mean, I apologize in advance. This is the most obvious question. You've been asked it 100 times already. But Casey Benedict, who is the star of the show, who is gripping and hugely, yes, interesting to read about, is she basically you?
I think there are autobiographical elements in it, and certainly a lot of my former career as an undercover investigative journalist, I go into it. But she's very much her own person, and more rogue than I ever went, to put it mildly, and also doesn't have much of a wish, you know, she takes risks that I don't think anybody even remotely sane would take. So
I was going to say, it was sort of quite a lot of wish fulfillment. I mean, would you ever been able to follow a lead in the way that Casey does?
I think the wish fulfillment came more, and I think Charlotte, another journalist, will sort of empathise with this, is that moment when, like, you know, as a journalist, you knock on the door trying to find out the story, and, you know, Casey's people go, oh yes, I'm delighted to tell you everything I know, or something. More often than not, I'd end up sort of, you know, 5 o'clock on a wet Friday afternoon, sitting there being like, all right, you don't want to talk, bye. No, it's like a brilliant time. You know, I was very, very lucky with my editors, and I did travel all over the world, and I did sort of do these really fascinating investigations. So on that front I did, but certainly Casey takes a few more risks than I.
Because you were, I mean, it says in one of your bios, you were an undercover journalist, which I'm dying to find out more about. I mean, how much can you tell us? Because, I mean, an undercover journalist is basically a spy.
I mean, it's interesting how many parallels there are. And when I first started writing this book, you know, there were definitely elements of it that came across quite dramatically that they share. But, you know, there were certainly weird parts. And I think what I like about writing these books is you can put in bits that the average reader, you know, by the time something appears in a newspaper, it's also clipped and neat and, you know, tidy. Whereas this shows a bit more like what happens behind the scenes, sort of chaos, you know, the technology we used, the tactics we used, all that sort of thing, really.
And that's one of the other things I was wondering about when I was reading it. One of the things that the book does so well is just evoke what it's like to be in a kind of a team of investigative journalists, so the camaraderie and so on. I mean, do you miss that? Is it a world away from being by yourself as a writer?
No, it really is, and I do miss it. And I'm lucky; I've kept in touch with quite a few of my journalist buddies. So you know, I do sort of reminisce with them, and I look back on it. It was a wonderful period of my life, but I'm also hugely enjoying writing books now. You know, I'm really glad I've had both things. I've got a small child now, so I think this fits in better with the lifestyle as well.
Right.
And I do miss the travel. I mean, certainly I think everybody at the moment with lockdown, pandemic, boredom misses traveling. But I really, you know, I feel like I haven't left the country this year, and that's compared to what I used to do. I used to travel so often I barely knew what country I was in. You know, so I definitely do that. My editor's currently, my editor at Bloomsbury is currently going through my third book, and she's like, I'm really enjoying all the sort of theoretical travel and, you know, going to Mauritius or this, that and the other. So yeah, I definitely miss it.
And there's one question I want to ask you, which I'm also going to ask in a slightly different form of everyone else. So you've got a bit more time to prepare. But I always think the best way to sort of get to know the main character in a book, and I think often that's what makes you want to read a book, is to work out what they do as they walk into a room, or how they react to a new situation. So if you and Casey Benedict, bear with me, you and Casey Benedict were to go out for an evening drink this evening, I mean, how would it play out? What kind of, I think, to give us a sense of what Casey is like, what do you think would happen?
I think Casey's a real chameleon person. I don't think she has much of a sense of who she is particularly. I think she's done so much undercover work that that's just who she is. She just adapts to whatever environment she's in. And so she would basically reflect back at you whatever you wanted to see. So I think she'd be fun for a night out, and you know, you'd have time, but you'd kind of be getting what you wanted rather than who she actually is. And I think that's almost so embedded in this kind of like workaholic, adrenalized world that she's sort of lost any sort of sense of reality. And she doesn't, you know, she's not great at friendships. Her love life is a bit of a chaos. You know, I think she's just one of those people who's sort of just lost sight really of who she is. But at the same time, is quite enjoying her life, and you know, she doesn't really have any idea of how to do anything else. So yeah, she'd be a night out, but
I know it sounds like a good night.
Who knows where you'd end up?
Okay, that's brilliant. I feel as I have anyone listening would have a better sense of the book. Let's move to Khurrum and Ride or Die. Can you tell us about Ride or Die? Can you introduce the book?
Yeah, so Ride or Die is the final part of the J. Casting trilogy. I think it was supposed to be a standalone. I'm not sure how I squeezed 3 books out of it, but this is the final. I'm not doing any more J books. I don't think anyway. I'm gonna take a break from him, but this is the final part, and we find Jay out of the game, out of the spy game. He wants to keep his head down and just get on with the norm. He's got himself a boring help desk job, and he's enjoying just being normal. He shares a dark history with MI5. He feels like they've used him, and he's happy to be away from them, but there's still some unfinished business thousands of miles away in North Pakistan, and he determined to get back into the game, but on his own terms, without the help of MI5. But MI5 are always there, always watching. And so yeah, I think I've run out of stories for Jay, to be honest. I think this is where he finally settles down, gets some peace. You know, I'll put him through the mill.
Yeah, you can go back to the hotel where he starts the book, which yeah, is a hotel I want to be at. Basically, I hope
In
he's
Qatar.
There.
Yeah, he's got his feet up. He thinks he's finished. That part of his life is finished. He's visiting his mum in Qatar, who he hasn't seen in a long time. And it's a visit from a friend of his who brings him back into that life, which he's trying to get away from desperately.
Yeah.
But because it's so personal to him, he has to jump back in. But he's going to do it on his own terms.
It's an amazing book. I loved it. Were there parts that you found hard to write? Were there parts which were sort of emotionally more draining than others?
The J part comes quite easy to me because I just feel like I've known so many different types of this character growing up with this kind of colourful character. But there's another character called Imran or Imi.
Yeah.
He was very difficult to write because he's a broken man, and I found it very hard to make that real because I haven't been through the things that he's been through. You know, the loss he's been through, his rage. I find it very difficult to relate to that. So that took a lot of time for me, I think. And generally the MI5 stuff I found tricky to write. I think that took a lot of research. I haven't got any contacts in that world. There was just hours and hours of online trying to figure out how they work.
Yeah. And it's one of the things I thought was so good about the book was the different voices for when you write about Jay as compared to when you write about Imi. Was it when you're writing the J sections, because it's so direct, did you feel as though you were addressing a particular person in your life? Did you feel like you were talking to a friend or anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think with most authors, our protagonist, especially if it's a series, he becomes a constant in your life. He becomes a friend, almost. With Jay, as I said, I grew up in Hounslow, and I was immediately drawn to this character because he's a small-time drug dealer who lives at home with his mum, and I wanted to drop him into a world which he does not recognize, and his reactions are very much how you'd expect someone who's out of their element to act in. I think, as I said, I mean, I find Jay very easy to write. His reactions, his decisions, which are normally wrong, they're very straightforward to me. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, well, let's move on to Charlotte and her book A Double Life, which can you tell us about that, please?
So A Double Life is a contemporary thriller set between London and Moscow, and it centres around the lives of two women. Gabriella is a negotiator at the Foreign Office, and Isabel is a sort of wayward local reporter. And through the stories, their lives converge. It's also one of 3 connected novels, which are all standalone. So the idea is that you could read the 3 of them, out in any order, and you would take something that would then sort of enhance your understanding of the other book. So the third one's coming out in July.
Fantastic. Which means, I mean, the third one is it complete? I know we're meant to be talking about A Double Life, but.
Yes. So by the end of that, there will be a total sense of resolution if you felt that you needed to understand things that happened in the previous book. The idea is that you could just take them as a sort of singular entity, or if you wanted to, you could sort of wait and find out what happens at the end of the first book. But they're all completely, they're sort of their own units. But yes, it's called The Final Act. So I'm very much drawing under a line under it for myself as much as for anyone else.
Yes, you're sounding quite relieved. It's and I loved the concept, the structure is beautifully written as well. The one thing I was intrigued by with a sort of a book which has such a bold, confident structure, did it change as you went along? I mean, did you stick very much to quite a rigid plan, or did it evolve?
Not at all. So I started with this sort of very confident map with post-it, sort of mapping out all the different scenes for the Gabriella section on this cork wall that I have. And I got to the end of writing it and I suddenly realised it's not the whole book. And I remembered I sort of wrote a very rough manuscript 10 years ago when I was on my first maternity leave about the detective. And I just started, well, I was a couple of years into working at The Independent, and I'd done work experience at the Camden New Journal, on which it's very much set. And I suddenly remembered it, and I pulled it out and sort of literally laced their stories together. So it started off as a completely standalone novel, not speaking to the first book that I'd written, Part of the Family, at all. But by the time I got to the end of the first draft of the second book, I suddenly realised that's the connection, and went back to my drawer and found this very rough manuscript that I'd written 10 years ago. And that's how Isabel came back to life.
Fascinating. That's really interesting. And what would you like readers to take away from the book?
I don't know. I guess I'm quite a selfish writer. I'm just interested in exploring ideas that I think are fascinating and hoping that they resonate with other people. I guess one of the main things for me is sort of looking at seemingly ordinary people and who make extraordinary and sometimes sort of unconscionable choices, and looking at how we understand them and their motivations and what it means to us to see how they behave and how we respond to that. So I think, it's very easy to look at somebody who's done something drastic and, sort of seemingly terrible, and sort of try to understand them through the lens of that. But I don't think we get anywhere directly in life. We make these choices as we go along, and I'm interested how you can be so many different people. One person can be so many different things, and what we do doesn't have to define us. So and sort of looking at women and how we understand their choices. Both of my books have sort of centered around women who have chosen to walk out on their families or betray their families in different ways. And I think I'm so fascinated in that, because it's a thing that men do all the time. My dad left, most of my friends' dads have left, and no one blinks. But if a woman leaves her family, it's such a shocking thing. But I'm just interested in how, what happens, how does someone do that, and how do we perceive them if they do? Not that I'm thinking of leaving my children. It's sort of, I guess it's
going to be my next question. Should we call in the divorce lawyers? Okay, that's really, really interesting. Thank you. And now, Charlie, can you tell us about the fantastic Box 88?
So Box 88 is the beginning of a new series of spy novels about Lachlan Kite, who is a boy from the west coast of Scotland, whose father died when he was very young. So we meet him when he's a teenager, and he's sent off in about 1985 to a school closely resembling Eton College. And he's a kind of fish out of water. He's from a different class, different background, different country. And he's thrown into this very strange, privileged, but also complicated ecosystem. And he flourishes there, and he's recruited in his final term, penultimate term, into a secret American, UK, US intelligence agency called Box 88, because his best friend's family are of interest to Box. So he goes off to the south of France and gets involved in a situation out there, an operation in France in 1989. And then the books will always have a contemporary storyline as well. So you meet Kite in the present day, and he has been in Box for his entire working life. He's now about my age, 48, 49. And this operation in France has come back to bite him in the, well, I can't use that word before, the watershed. Typically in the stories that there'll be something that went on in Kite's younger career, which has had an effect in contemporary times. And the idea came from a conversation I had with a guy who worked in SIS in MI6, who said that a lot of people inside MI6 believe that there is a sort of a deep state agency, a kind of box within MI6 where jobs are being done and operations are being hatched that the vast majority of MI6 officers know nothing about. So typically, Downing Street, for example, will give a list of what they call requirements to MI6, saying, get me more information on Vladimir Putin, get me more information on President Xi. But Box will say to themselves, they'll notice where the gaps are and they'll fill them in. They'll do the jobs that typically shouldn't or can't be done. So they're very much sort of deep state, under the radar, doing necessary but quite naughty things. And Kite is in front of that.
Well, it's fantastic. And just briefly, it's reminiscent of, there's a line by John le Carre where he once said that the English condition is summed up with the idea that you hear about a club and you eventually get into the club. Then you hear about a club within the club and eventually get into that. But then once you're within the club, you hear there's another club within the club and you try to get into that, but you get too old and you die. There's always another club, is I think what he sometimes says.
Well, Box 88 really is the sort of ultimate club. That was actually Ben McIntyre's theory about Charlotte's grandfather, Kim. Sorry, how can you get through an entire interview with Charlotte without mentioning it? One of the reasons that he
I was trying my noble best.
No, I think you're absolutely right that there is. And Eton obviously is a very elite institution in and of itself, and so is MI6. And so I was at that school, and it's a kind of at once a great privilege, but also it's a sort of huge, what do you call it, the sort of thing, the mock Tudor building that I kind of carry around on the back of my shoulder. You keep quiet about having gone to Eton. It's only invaded every corner of public life. And I quite wanted to write about that and to describe what my experience was of being there. I call it Alford College in Box 88, but it's very obviously Eton. So that, because obviously there's a lot of prejudice around it, and there's a lot of misinformation. There's also a lot of accurate understanding of what going to school there is like. So I wanted to put that down and to see why it is that so many intelligence officers, SOE, MI6, and MI5 have come out of Eton. What is it about that school that it's a sort of incubating laboratory for spooks?
Yeah. This is fascinating. And what's the, one of the things I want to know, because you've got obviously a series of different series already under your belt. How would you say this is sort of different? I mean, what's the kind of, where are you taking us that you haven't been before?
It was part like when we, at the top of the show, you said I'd run 10 novels, and spying has changed a lot in the 20 years that I've been writing. My first couple of books don't have Google in them, there's no mobile phones, there's no number plate recognition cameras, there's no CCTV of any note, and tradecraft in the sort of post 9/11 environment has just changed drastically, and so much of stuff is done online and SIGINT and so forth, and that's good for. I mean, everybody else will speak to this too because they have experience of it, but that's good for storytelling, but it cramps your storytelling because spying is about obtaining information, and if you're obtaining information from a laptop or from somebody's phone or from a Wi-Fi signal, it's not particularly dramatic. Whereas if you're obtaining information from somebody and you've got to go and meet them, you've got to go across the Glenica Bridge in 1962, whatever, it's much more dramatic, much more interesting, because then you have a human element to it. So I increasingly wanted to write really historical books. I wanted to write about the 1980s and 1990s, where you could do some good old-fashioned spying. And actually, it was a conversation with my editor, Julia Wisdom at HarperCollins, and she said, well, it's silly for you to completely abandon 21st century espionage, and you've written all these books that are set in the present day, and at that point there weren't that many people doing that. And so we kind of cooked up this idea to have the flashback, to have the two timelines, which I think has worked well. Yeah,
no, it's fantastic. And just briefly, last thing, so we can all get a better sense of our new hero, Lockie. This evening you get a call from Lockie. You need to go for a night out with him. How does it play out? What kind of a hero are we dealing with here?
So he's basically an old Etonian, and I'm basically an old Etonian. We're just trying to avoid each other. Like, oh Christ, not another one. And he'd much rather be with somebody else, I would have thought. He's tougher than me. I think he's lonelier than I am. He's a lot more damaged, braver. But there's no question about it, he's had a much more exciting life than I have. I've just sat in a room for 20 years typing and occasionally making jokes.
He'd be doing most of the talking then.
He'd be doing, well, I would just ask him lots of questions. I need the material, you know. What am I going to do?
This is great. Well, look, I think now we can open it up. We can everyone can talk over each other whenever they like. The main question we've been asked to answer is, why do we have such an enduring fascination with secret agents and double lives? What does everybody think?
Oh, I don't know when to start. That's just part of the human sort of nature, isn't it? That, you know, if it's something like enjoying crosswords and Sudoku, to like that sense of trying to work out what's going on. Just there, it's just embedded in us all. And particularly in a story situation, you want to kind of power through it and pick up clues as you go along and enjoy the thing.
Yeah. Yes.
For me, it's the lifestyle of a spy. I think it's quite a warped view of what a real spy does, but it's almost a very sexy life. The exotic locations, the cars, the gadgets. I know these are fictional spies, but I think it's the lifestyle that attracts me to the fascination with spies for me. And I think what I love most about it is the betrayal, you know, the double cross, that reveal.
It's Charlotte, what were you saying?
I just think because if we take sort of real life spy characters, so for example, you mentioned my grandfather Kim, with whom there's an enduring appeal, and I think it's because people like that, we are so shocked and sort of shocked by their ability not just to make these really extreme choices, but to see them through in every aspect of their lives. And I think people want to understand, they want to really sort of get inside their motivations. And the thing about these people is you can't, because everybody, you know, I've spoken to so many people who have absolutely sort of resolute ideas about why my grandfather and the other spies, particularly in the Cold War, did what they did. And the truth is, we can never fully believe what they say, or sort of deign to know everything that there is to know about what's happened, no matter how many files are revealed. So other things have been redacted, and I just think there's, you know, we're just desperate to get to the bottom of something that actually there is no bottom of. And I just think it's fascinating, this idea that there is a single truth, that, you know, we will sort of all be able to understand these people through. But I just think it's a combination of so many factors that, you know, we can keep digging and we'll never actually find the gold. And that's sort of why we're all so desperate to try, maybe.
Charlie, why are we digging?
I think there's something very seductive about being a spy, having a double life, whether you're working on behalf of the secret state and keeping people safe in their beds, or you're working against the state as an agent or whatever.
And why? What do you think makes it seductive? What do you think makes it seductive?
Well, I think all of us, to a greater or lesser extent in our lives, are lying from time to time and putting on masks from time to time and pretending to be somebody that we're not, or disguising things about ourselves, or trying to find out about other people. So you come back from a party, you're sitting on the tube or in the car with your wife, what do you think about X? What do you think about Y? I mean, it's sort of, spying is a kind of heightened version of gossip, really, that you're able to discover extraordinarily complicated and secret things about your neighbor, so to speak. I mean, this is a sort of a metaphoric level, you know, you're peering into the keyhole of something that you shouldn't be doing that, and you're allowed to do that. You're being paid to do that, and by doing so, you may save the world or stop somebody defecting or whatever it might be. And I think there's something, all of us probably have Charlotte was talking about this before, in terms of often, you know, men abandoning their families or running out. Everybody has a sort of from time to time, a sort of fantasy of another life, of escaping into a new identity or so forth. And an intelligence officer is allowed to do that 3 times a year. So and can go around with a wallet with a different name and a different passport and a different identity. It can be called Peter and pretend to be an accountant for 6 months. And people probably quite interested in that instead of every single day home.
I think that is the most sort of appealing part of it. I remember there's a screenwriting book I read once where it said the root of all drama is saying one thing but meaning something else. And that is essentially spying writ large. It's it's what drives story and dramatic situations. I mean, I'm thinking about just sort of spy. We talked about the appeal of spying. What I'd love to know, there's Le Carré once said, he does sometimes get it wrong. He may have got it wrong here. I'd love to know what you think. He said that the world of spies is the collective couch where the subconscious of each nation is confessed. Do you think, I mean, if you were someone trying to work out Britain today, do you think spy novels would be a good place to start?
You're on, Holly.
I didn't want to point the finger at anyone.
I have to answer first. I'm trying to think. I mean, I think certainly, something like I've just finished Box 88, which is brilliant. But that does give you quite an interesting insight. I mean, a fascinating insight. Sorry, quite interesting to unplays it. Of where the world is today and where it was 20 years ago, and particularly how a certain group or class within the UK operates and how they expect to operate. I think it would give you a fairly good idea of that particular sort of strata of people. Trying to think of other examples. Sorry, somebody else say something.
Yeah,
I agree. I agree. I think with class, it's important. I mean, I write from point of view of a British Muslim and how we feel about our environment, our government, how divisive things are at the moment. So I think it's on the author. It depends on the author's background, what kind of information you want to get from that novel, be it fiction, but there's a lot of truth in what we're trying to portray. So I think class it depends on the class of the author as well and their background.
Yep. And just sort of jumping onto something completely different. So lockdown, coronavirus inspired lockdown. I just thinking about what it is to be a spy during that. Is this something which any of you are beginning to work into a future book, or is it just sort of complete Armageddon for spying that everyone has to go? I mean, spies have to have a holiday as well.
I'm to the 40s. I have absolutely. I just want to retreat from the world as it is at the moment. So I've taken the decision to take a massive step backwards.
Fantastic, Charlie. Any lockdowns?
Ended up the sequel to Box 88 is taking place this year,
right?
Because it is quite interesting what's happened to spying in this period. That it's sort of musical chairs and everything has had to stop. So if you want to go and meet an agent in a very simple sense, go and meet an agent, you cannot go and meet him or her in the places where you might ordinarily have done so. Let's say a football match at Stamford Bridge or in Westfield Shopping Mall, everything's closed. If you're following somebody around, surveillance has just got to stand down because the team of people tailing someone is just, they're going to be so obvious because there's nobody else on the streets, there's no natural cover. Yeah. If you've got a business overseas, which is, universal exports type thing operating out of Paris, which has fake employees, you've now got to furlough a bunch of fake employees. Even if you meet somebody, even if you're meeting an agent, do you wear a mask? Do you socially distance from somebody who's in a cell who's feeding you information?
Or do you just do the whole thing on Zoom?
It might be that my book dates very fast, but I think it's quite interesting just to kind of get it down. And hopefully this is the worst of it and there won't be sort of lockdown 4. And we'll all be sitting here still on Zoom calls in 2031. When's it going to end? No, I think it will probably the worst of it. So, but it's an interesting period in espionage, no question. Also, maybe quite good if you're in I don't know, Dubai doing something you shouldn't be doing, and the CCTV cameras everywhere, and we know that that's Hollywood. We know that that's Charles Cumming. We know that's, but you've got a mask on and some sunglasses.
Yes,
you can do all sorts of stuff now that you couldn't already do. So
here is a man who has thought it through entirely. I'm glad to us.
I've done several very illegal things.
Holly, is there a lockdown in your next book?
No, there isn't. I think I was sort of at least halfway, if not 3/4 of the way of writing through the third one when lockdown it was sort of coming closer and closer, and I was just like, everybody else was like, I don't want to go into lockdown because it'd be so awful. I'd be like, it'll be chaotic for my book. I don't know what to do. Very self-centered way of approaching it. I've just sort of basically leapfrogged lockdown because it's coming out in July next year, and it was almost impossible to anticipate where we'd be by July next year. So I decided, to be honest, I think possibly if I was like writing my 10th novel, you know, I'd sort of be more interested in bringing it in, whereas I'm sort of just on my 3rd and I'm kind of just enjoying writing those, and I just didn't want to tie her down in one room on a Zoom call. I couldn't think of a way of making it work.
Yeah. Now, one set of questions which always gets asked at literary do's like this is to do with the writing process and to do with research and so on. I'd love to know because all authors have different requirements when it comes to just how far you'll go with your research. Charlie, what's the furthest you've gone on research? I mean, do you often travel purely to get a sense of a place that you're writing about?
Yeah, I've always gone to the places that I've written about, with the exception of Xinjiang in China. I didn't go to Xinjiang to write that small section in Typhoon, but I've been everywhere else. It's the sort of bit that I really love because it's tax deductible. You're away from your desk. You can get some sunshine in February.
Yes. I was wondering why so many of your protagonists go to 5-star hotels in Dubai during January.
No, but it's a great part of it too. But it's I don't believe that you can really write accurately to a place, certainly sort of in a contemporary place, unless you walk the ground and sniff the air and eat the food and talk to the people. It's a sort of version of what's that thing called cultural appropriation. You need to get there and experience it. That's my view. But there are incredibly gifted writers, Hilary Mantel or Bernard Cornwell, who often must have a sort of time machine, because they're able to create these environments from 400, 500 years ago, which is really the same thing, isn't it? They didn't go there.
Yeah.
But that's just my personal view. I need to go, and I enjoy going. I find writing quite sort of gerbil wheel. You know, I like to break it up a bit.
Yeah. Charlotte, what's your research process?
Well, it's been rather thwarted because the next book I'm writing requires some travel around Europe, and we were supposed to be on just ending a 6-month drive around Europe, which obviously didn't happen because of Corona. So I'm having to sort of go back to the archives and work through that before I actually put my foot on the ground where I'm writing about next. But I have intentionally, with the 3 novels that I've now finished, set them in places that I know sufficiently well. So they're largely set in North London, where I grew up, and then Greece and the Maldives, of course, because if it was ever made for TV, it would be terrible if I had to go over there and just assist.
It'd be a form of torture.
I know, but I might brave it just for the art.
Yes.
But I mean, I've always incorporated my own experiences, be it with motherhood, be it with working as a journalist. You know, it has to be. They're sort of vaguely outlandish stories, even if they are based in truth. So there has to be elements that are just so exact, I think, in order to give it a sort of credibility. So that for me comes from the geography and the sort of some of the nuts and bolts, and then the rest of it is sort of ludicrous, but hopefully works.
And Khurrum, you were talking before about your research, as in some of your research for the MI5 sections is lots and lots and lots of Googling and searching online. What does the other research involve?
Well, I've never traveled in the name of research. I don't particularly want to go to Afghanistan at this moment, but I think most of my research is done in this room. The 2 locations are Afghanistan and Hounslow. Hounslow I know inside out. I grew up there. My main research, to be honest, is character research, and the best way to do that is to step away from the computer and talk to people. Talk to people who are affected by. So my books are about terrorism, so people who have been affected by terrorism, and gauge their views. And I think that's the most real way I can portray that in a book. I try to keep Googling to a minimum, to limited, because whenever I research online, it shows in my work that this bit looks researched, so it's very hard for me to make it natural. So to do that, I think I think talking to people is the best way, is the most genuine way to get my message across.
Yeah. Holly, what's actually, I know part of it. Didn't you fly to Bangladesh for?
Yeah, no, I did. I think, certainly for the first 2 books, my research as it was essentially a byproduct of the journalism. So whether it's like, you know, refugee camps in Jordan or Libya or Bangladesh refugee camps. I mean, I certainly traveled to these places. I've always felt that like you learn so much more about a country literally on the drive from the airport to the hotel. You just sort of, I just love that feeling of getting somewhere new and just sort of going straight into it. For the third one, I traveled to Zimbabwe. And a friend of mine was working in a hospital. The third one's partly based on antibiotic resistance. So that was just quite an extraordinary thing, going to these hospitals in Zimbabwe, which particularly at the moment are going through absolutely hideous times, although obviously it's been very difficult. Time there for a long time, and I love the traveling. I always enjoyed that in journalism, and this sense of exploring the world and sort of getting a sense of it all. And I do notice though when I'm writing that my books get a lot more descriptive when they're not in the UK, because when I'm traveling somewhere, I'm just taking notes all the time. So then when I sit down to write the novel, it's like I use all my notes. I want to use all the information I've got. Whereas in London, I'm just like, yeah, the was grey and
wet. Covers a lot.
Yeah.
That's great. Charlotte, you were talking about the possibility of a TV option. One of the things that I'm intrigued by is just the effect of TV on and spy TV on spy fiction, on novels. Do you, all of you, aware in different ways of the effect of successful TV spies, or is it something you just block out?
Well, Charlotte was saying just a second ago that she's going to go to Mauritius for
Maldives, I think.
Maldives, sorry.
Yeah.
But,
I'm not,
maybe both.
No, but I was going to say that development in TV is so geologically slow, but by the time you get out there, you'll be 86 and it'll be in and film and TV, I think, again, like I was saying, there was no Google in 2019, whatever it was, that I wrote The Hidden Man and Spy by Nature. And there weren't any spy novels either, and there was hardly any spy stuff on TV. It was in that gap between the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11. And then since then, obviously, there's been, Daniel Craig has kind of given Bond another boost. You've had Jason Bourne, you've had 24, you've had Night Manager. I mean, you can't move for spy stories. Condor's now on Sky, so so we're sort of saturated in spy stories. Plus, you've had Snowden in the real world, and you've had the lovely Mr. Assange, guest at the Ecuadorian embassy. So there's been real life, hugely exciting real life spy stories in the last 20 years. So it's a crowded market. Whether or not it has an effect on writing, I don't know. I'm always slightly insulted when people say it's written like a treatment for a film. And it's just, that's not really what it is. You just always remember the bad reviews.
Yeah. As a historian, that's high praise. If someone says that about one of my books, that's what you want.
I mean, everybody, you could get a book made into a TV series or a film, and it can be really bad for a writer's career. If a bad film is made of one of your books, then that will filter down, and equally you can. It's hugely helpful.
Yeah.
But I think it would be fair to say that you've mentioned him a couple of times. Mr. Le Carré has been sort of blocking the road for a while in terms of adaptations.
Yes, and I guess he will continue to for some time. There are more on the way in the ink factory pipeline.
I've always been quite surprised about how few investigative journalists have, their novels about them. I mean, there are quite a few examples, but, there just aren't as many as you'd think, and especially not on TV, really. There've been a few. I mean, State of Play was brilliant. Spotlight was great. But, there's just, because I remember quite early on during my journalism career, just talking to somebody who may or may not have had a fairly sensitive job about just how incredibly similar our jobs were, that get a sort of hint of information from somewhere, some sort of tip off, some sort of thought even, go away, build contacts, talk to people, do the research, do everything else, write up a report. In my case, it would be read by several 100,000 people. In their case, it might be read by 3-4 people. But it's just the incredible parallels of what our day-to-day lives actually involved. So, I mean, I think that's why it does work well in a novel setting for that investigative journalism. But yeah, it'd be great to see more of them on TV.
And actually, but why do you think that is? Because I've always noticed the way investigative journalists portrayed in America is very different to how they're seen in Britain. I mean, in America, they are kind of shining bastions of democratic virtue and honor. And in Britain, they're not. I don't know where that comes from. Are you conscious of that sort of difference?
Yeah, I think there's an incredibly different perception. I did something called the Lawrence Stern Fellowships. I went to work in the Washington Post for 3 months, and then I did a month traveling around America, which was absolutely brilliant. But, you know, my first day at the Washington Post, I sort of got dragged aside, sat down, had a proper ethics chat about what was appropriate and what wasn't. Yeah, I'd never had that in years on Fleet Street. And that's quite a shock, something. I was like, well, you don't do that? You don't, you know, I mean, you doing undercover stuff in America, they basically just never do it.
Yeah.
I think we can't pretend that British journalism hasn't at times not entirely covered itself in glory along the way. So you can't totally criticise the perception of it. But no, I think, well, you know, there are a lot of journalists in this country that are doing really extraordinary work and, you know, working incredibly hard to do things that are important. Sometimes a bit lost in the wash.
It's our tabloid culture gives journalists a bad name, and the sort of the fake shake is sort of, whereas you're at the Post and you've got Woodward and Bernstein, and they're so lionized there, and they call down Nixon, and they look like Robert Redford. You know, it's they've done journalism in America a huge service.
Yeah. And Khurrum, just thinking of TV, I think did you dedicate your book to the films that inspired your book? Am I imagining that? Yes, the movies that inspired my book.
I mean, film is my first love. And spy films I absolutely adore. I think my favorite fictional character is Jason Bourne. Not to the point where he's had any influence on my writing. I think Jay is on the opposite, the other extreme to Jason Bourne. He's more Austin Powers than Jason Bourne, I think. or somewhere in the middle. But I am totally fascinated with spy movies, and just generally films. I think I wrote all my books as I would write a screenplay almost. I think the it's very visual. I think it pops off the page, and when I'm writing, it's almost like a film reel going through my head. Film's always my first love, and I think if my stories were ever optioned, I don't think there is a spy ever portrayed on screen like Jay would be. You know, I think he's very unique in that way.
Have you seen Tenet, Khurrum?
Not yet. I'm going to see it on the weekend, hopefully.
I'm going tonight.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It's supposed to be amazing. A bit trippy, right?
A bit complicated.
Yeah. Apparently you need to sit down in a dark room for quite a while afterwards. That's what I've
So just stay in your seat, basically.
Exactly that. And Charlotte, is TV and the world of film, does this play a big part in sort of inspiring or changing the way you write?
I don't think that I write in a very filmic way, but I'm definitely inspired by film, and I enjoy great television as much as I enjoy books. So I don't really, and I don't necessarily think there's a divide, or you know, there is obviously a divide, but they can equally be enjoyed, and for similar reasons, even if, you know, they're obviously nuanced as well. So I'm a huge TV and film buff. I would charge you to name one thing on Netflix that I have not watched, especially as I'm currently in quarantine. So not being going to the cinema fills me with absolute horror and envy. But yeah, I watch a lot.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, look, we're coming to an end. We have barely a minute left. I thought maybe a nice way to finish is just to go around everyone naming their favorite fictional spy, apart from one that they've actually invented themselves. maybe apart from one that's been written about by someone in this particular panel, because it'll all get a bit personal. But yes, Charlie, favorite fictional spy who you haven't created?
I like those Eric Ambler guys. You know, they're sort of ordinary men. It's always men from ordinary circumstances who are sort of thrown into extraordinarily exciting environments and operations and plots, and they have to use their native cunning to get out of it. So typically, Journey into Fear, Eric Ambler's Journey into Fear, or what's he called? Is he called Charles Latimer, the guy in Mask of Demetrius?
I think
And
so. I
obviously,
remember it being quite a kind
another
of
Carrie fan who
set
still
guy.
people Carrie.
Yeah. Lovely. Khurrum.
Yeah, as I said, for me, it's Jason Bourne. I just love
Yeah.
how cold and calculating he is, almost emotionless. And the way he looks, he will just fit into any environment. He's not particularly handsome or flamboyant. He's just run of the mill. And yeah, Jason Bourne for me.
I think James Bond. I really enjoy reading them, and I love watching them. So.
And I think we've lost Charlotte temporarily. Anyway, let us wrap everything up. Thank you all so much for taking part. That was fantastic. That was really, really interesting. And I hope everyone watching enjoys it too. Thank you all.